Welcome to The Awakening, Black Women United. I am your host, Sherry Donnie. Subscribe, like, share, comment, and hit the notification bell so you know every time I upload a new video. African Woman says African nations owe African Americans reparations and are just as guilty and violent as were the white Europeans. She wants to know why only Europeans are shamed for the transatlantic slave trade and the brutality of slavery, but not the Africans. Umar Johnson and other African American Pan-Africanists have minimized Africa's brutal role in the slave trade, saying they did not know it would be as horrific as it was. However, in the clips, I will show they were fully aware and did not care.
Continental African who has taken the time to educate herself on the topic of slave trade that happened especially in the west coast of Africa centuries ago. I strongly hold the opinion that continental Africans should pay reparations to descendants of enslaved Africans who now live in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and in Europe. Because the slave trade that happened on the continent was a transaction between the Europeans and the Africans who participated in that atrocious trade. Now, when you visit the sites that now stand as relics of this slave trade, you will see just how inhumane, how horrendous slave trade was. So I wonder why when calls for reparations and apologies for these horrendous acts are made, they are usually targeted at the Europeans who participated in the trade that was between them and Africans. I understand the sentiments, but like I said, as a continental African, I've visited quite some sites. I've been to Ghana, I've seen the Osu slave castle, I've seen the slave trade relics at Badagry, which I'm talking about in this video. I can say authoritatively and audaciously that continental Africans are just as complicit and should be made to pay reparations for slave trade that happened.
Involvement in the slave trade, its impact on modern perspectives, and the call for recognition, reconciliation, and perhaps even reparations. The transatlantic slave trade was not simply a matter of Europeans arriving on African shores and seizing unsuspecting victims. A complex network of African intermediaries facilitated the trade, connecting the interior of the continent to the coastal slave castles. Powerful kingdoms like the Asante Empire in present-day Ghana, the Oyo Empire in Nigeria, and the Kingdom of Congo rose to prominence through their participation in the trade. These empires engaged in warfare specifically to capture slaves, raiding neighboring communities and selling captives to European traders. The trade routes, often spanning hundreds of miles, were fraught with danger and brutality, further compounding the suffering of those enslaved.
Okay. So any slave handed to the white men, they have these chains around the neck. So that waterfront there, which is the slave port, happened to be the largest slave port in West Africa.
Okay.
So any slave handed to the white men, they have these chains around the neck. You can come in. They have these chains around the neck like this. And to be around the neck like this for good 18 hours every day. They use the remaining 6 hours to relax.
Having these chains around my neck is so painful. The chains are literally weighing me down, like pulling me down. Now imagine what pain those enslaved went through, wearing these chains on their neck for hours, months. Not only on their necks, their hands, their legs, they were shackled. Now I wonder, why? Why would man sit and conceive such a horrendous act?
The primary motivation for African rulers and traders to participate in the slave trade was economic gain. European goods, including guns, textiles, and alcohol, became highly sought-after status symbols. These goods, acquired in exchange for enslaved Africans, were used to consolidate power, armies, and secure political dominance. The slave trade created a vicious cycle of dependency, where African leaders became reliant on European goods and the wealth generated by selling their own people.
Why it was called blacknationalism is because most of the slavery laid out of this compound through this slave port across the lagoon called Lagos Novo Lagoon, down to point of no return. They are being taken to Brazil. Most of them are being taken to Brazil, while all that are being taken to Europe. But The man you are seeing in the picture happened to be the rightful owner of this compound. His birth name is Farem Lepo. This man, at a very tender age of 6, was captured and sold into slavery. You know, because they doesn't have to bear their master's name. So this man has to bear master's name. The first master who bought this man is called Abbas. Abbas lived in Dahomey, Benin Republic. In those days, it was called Dahomey before later changed to Benin Republic. Now, it was there and taken as domestic slave. He was there as domestic slave, and that gave the opportunity to Mr. Williams, who used to come all the way from Brazil in the purpose of buying slaves from Africa. He always saw this gentle boy with his master, Mr. Abbas, and he demanded to buy him from Mr. Abbas. And Mr. Abbas now resold him to Mr. Williams. That means his name now changed to Williams Abbas. After many years he have lived with Mr. Abbas, Mr. Abbas called him one day, Mr. Man, come, I want to give you your freedom, but on one condition. He now told Mr. Abbas that you are my master. Whatever you wish, you can do. So he said, I will send you back to your country. You'll be doing the running rounds I'm supposed to do, going from interland to interland, from village to village, from town to town in search of slaves. You'll be doing that for me. He accepted the offer and he sent him back to Nigeria. He first based in Lagos Island before he acquired this land and built this compound of 40 slave cells. In 1840s, they kept 40 slaves in each of the cells, and that gave us the total number of slaves kept in this compound to be 1,600 slaves that lived the shore of this country through this slave port across this lagoon called Lagos Port Novo Lagoon down to point of no return. And because of the kind of currency we use in those days that doesn't have value in international market, that is why the European masters, they came about what we call trade by barter. You know, the slaves, they are goods to their masters. Do you know the value of one umbrella? The value for one umbrella is 40 slaves, 40 human beings. Everyone, strong men and women, 40 for one umbrella. A bottle of gin or a wine is for 10 slaves each. The long cannon gun is for 100 slaves, while the short one is for 40 slaves. The mirror and the bead depend on how you bargain. While the ceramic bowl is for 10 slaves, while the gun is for 40 slaves. So, this is the light umbrella. Don't touch the cloth. This is the umbrella you can touch here for 40 human beings. You can lift it up. Go to there. We'll try. Clap for yourself.
This economic incentive, coupled with existing internal conflicts and power struggles, fueled the engine of the transatlantic slave trade for centuries. While the horrors of slavery are undeniable, the narrative surrounding it has often minimized the role of Africans. This minimization, often perpetuated by both African and non-African scholars, portrays Africans as passive victims, stripped of agency and incapable of having played an active role in the trade. This narrative, while understandable in its desire to emphasize the brutality inflicted upon Africans, ultimately paints an incomplete and historically inaccurate picture.
And the slave trade started here in Badagry 15 centuries ago. So the trade lasted for good 400 years before it was abolished. So at my right side here we have the grave of the chief controlled Badagry during the days of slave trade. His name Chief Sumbu Mobi. He died October 16, 1893. So during his own time, slavery stopped in Badagry 1886 after the trade lasted 400 years. So Chief Sumbu Mobi's father eventually participated during the days of slave trade. His one nickname Mobi by the white men, because whenever the white people came to buy slave, he always offered them with a kola nut. Spoke with them in Yoruba that Oremi Oyibo Emu Obije means my white friends pick kola nut and eat. Why his own name is very difficult for the white people to pronounce, let's say calling him, we are looking for Chief Mobi. So that's where the name Mobi derived from. So at my left side here we have the original chain used on our forefather during the days of slave trade. And this chains was brought here by the white men to here around 15 centuries ago, roughly 500 to 600 years now. This very chain that we are seeing here. And during the holding days, all this environment used as a slave corridor, slave was brought from outside Badagry, from interland. Like Oyo, Oshogbo, Abeokuta, Ibadan, Ondo, different places like that. During the days of slave trade, we have two coasts. We have slave market in Calabar. The name of the market called Eyong Slave Market, established in the year 1810. So in each market day in Calabar, 100 slaves were being sold in a day. So now here in Badagry, we have Vlikete slave market, established in the year 1502. In each market here in Badagry, 300 slaves were being sold in a day.
Acknowledging the agency of African rulers and traders does not diminish the suffering of those enslaved. Instead, it provides a more nuanced understanding of the complex power dynamics at play and allows for a more honest reckoning with this dark chapter of history. The reparations debate, a continent divided. She observes that the 400th anniversary of the arrival of slaves in Virginia coincides with questions about guilt and responsibility, and a debate in the United States about reparations to the descendants of slaves. African Woman says African nations owe African Americans reparations and are just as guilty and violent as were the white Europeans. She wants to know why only Europeans are shamed for the transatlantic slave trade and the brutality of slavery, but not the Africans. She observes that this fraught debate is largely absent in Africa, even though Africans were deeply involved in the slave trade. Africans raided for slaves often in connivance with local chiefs and then acted as middlemen with European and Arab purchasers. She recounts stories of the ambivalence of at least some Africans about the role of their ancestors in the slave trade. She reports that Donald Duke, former governor of Calabar State and a good government presidential candidate in the 2019 Nigerian elections, acknowledges that his ancestors participated in the slave trade. However, Duke says, "I'm not ashamed of it because I wasn't directly involved." However, he does not want history to be forgotten. While governor, he established a museum of Calabar's history as a slave exporting hub. Others are deeply embarrassed by their ancestors' participation and try to hide it.
And during the holding days, all this environment used as a slave corridor, slave was brought from outside Badagry, from interland, like Oyo, Oshogbo, Abeokuta, Ibadan, Ondo, different places like that. During the days of slave trade, we have two coasts. We have slave market in Calabar. The name of the market called Young Slave Market, established in the year 1810. So in each market day in Calabar, 100 slaves were being sold in a day. So now here in Badagry, we have Vlikete slave market, established in the year 1502. In each market here in Badagry, 300 slaves were being sold in a day.
When you come to Badagry in Lagos, Nigeria, there's a lot of history here, colonial history, slave trade history, and just the history of the people. So being in Badagry, I want to come see for myself the relics of the slave trade that happened in this area in Nigeria. This was a major slave trade hub in Nigeria. Slaves were captured here, sold here, and transported via that body of water that is part of the Atlantic Ocean to lands unknown. So we are going
Some
to have
still think they are paying the price for their ancestors' sins, quoting the book of Exodus that God is visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Sub-Saharan Africa. Nwabani's Welcome Report provides another dimension to the conversation about slavery, in Africa as well as in the United States. But the subject is painful. Nwabani recounts a conversation with a Tanzanian now living in the United States. Because of the crimes, the pain, the humiliation that I saw them, descendants of slaves, suffer in the United States, he avoided talking about his family's role in slavery, instead highlighting Tanzanian music, architecture, and poetry. It has been established that the demand for slaves during the transatlantic slave trade was fueled by the availability of a supply chain that involved African rulers and tradesmen who made a fortune out of selling people. Between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to North America, the Caribbean, and South America, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. Only about 10.7 million survived the dreadful journey under bondage in slave ships. The slave trade contributed to the expansion of the most powerful West African kingdoms such as Mali and Ghana, as the business became one of the main sources of foreign exchange for many years.
They're lucky to padlock.
wow.
And two of them continue working, going at the same time at once. Let's try. You can see.
My goodness.
This use on stubborn slave who refuse to work on the farm. They have to force his hands by force.
This is so small. They force their hand.
Yeah, by force.
Well, my hand
Up
can
to his
pass.
wrist. They now remove this screw it up, on a tall tree, while his two legs will be dangling, punishment for the stubborn slave. This use on children to guide their
Even children.
Yeah, they do. They guide their children not to disturb their parents while working on sugarcane plantation. They have to join 2 or 3 kids hands together like this. They lock down padlock while their parents busy working on the farm. So this use of mouth to prevent those slaves not to eat while working on sugarcane plantation, or for them not to talk to the one and now while working on sugarcane plantation. So this is very, very horrible. So why this was used for 3 purposes. The first purpose is they put these objects into a fire when it is very red hot. They used to pierce their lips like this,
Okay. They'll pass it through their
both
lips.
up and down. Then I'll fix this. They draw the lips out very well. They have to lock it with padlock like this and like that. If you guide them not to eat or to talk to the one and not while working on sugarcane plantation.
In a 2010 article published in the New York Times, Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. said, "Slaves were the main export of the Kingdom of Congo. The Asante Empire in Ghana exported slaves and used the profits to import gold. Queen Njinga, the brilliant 17th century monarch of the Mbundu, waged wars of resistance against the Portuguese, but also conquered polities as far as 500 miles inland and sold her captives to the Portuguese." Umar Johnson and other African-American Pan-Africanists have minimized Africa's brutal role in the slave trade, saying they did not know it would be as horrific as it was.
Number one, our extreme sense of humanity and concern. African people are the ultimate humanitarians because we are the first people and we are the most spiritual. So we have a history of treating people the way that we want to be treated. We don't care what color you are. You are a human being. We're going to treat you the way that we want to be treated. That's part of our spiritual foundation. Unfortunately, we were very politically uneducated about the European because our contact with him, although it did exist, our education and understanding of them was very limited. And so as a result of that, we succumbed to the brutality, the lack of humanity, the savagery, and the ruthlessness of European culture.
Okay, but even though we are bigger in stature, mind capabilities, how could it be for over, you're talking centuries of this, hundreds and hundreds of years of being that we're the superior beings on this planet? I don't really like to say race, but the superior beings on this planet. How is it possible that the same one fight is still going on in 2023?
They were fully aware and did not care. Umar Johnson is a fool and a clown. Britain banned the slave trade in 1807, and the United States later abolished it in 1865. Brazil was the last to ban it in the Caribbean in 1888, marking the end of the barbarism inflicted on men, women, and children of African descendants.
Or their daughter, they do castrate them.
To prevent them from having sex.
Yeah. So they do castrate them. That is to say, they do castrate some of the male slaves during the era of slavery. This talks about resistance and public punishments, how the slaves were being maltreated during the days of slave trade. Also, this talks about the marching to the coast, means marching to the point of no return. Here was called point of no return during days of slave trade. A lot of tourists do go here now and they return back home successfully. We look at the slave market, finally established in the year 1502 here in Badagry and the Middle Passage. This is how our brothers and our sisters in diaspora were being exported to the unknown destination. Why taking them away? When the captain of this ship discovered that the boat is too much loaded, they have to drop some for the lighter of the ship. So finally, this talks about separation of a family. Means this man will be sold to this client, this woman will be sold to this client. That family will never come across itself to the end of their life.
This is one of the family compound of the family that was involved in the slave trade at that time. So when you hear about slave trade, it might sound like myth or like stories, because of how horrible and everything it sounds, but it actually did happen. And monuments like this or relics like this attest to the fact that it did happen and should never have even happened in the first place. The slave barracoon, where the slaves were kept. So we'll go inside and have a look. Brazilian barracoon.
And Brazil means slave seller.
There were recorded protests by West African chiefs and traders after the abolition of the slave trade. According to Nigerian author Tunde Obadina, when Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, it not only had to contend with opposition from white slavers, but also from African rulers who had become accustomed to wealth gained from selling slaves or from taxes collected on slaves passed through their domain. African slave trading classes were greatly distressed by the news that legislators sitting in Parliament in London had decided to end their source of livelihood. But for as long as there was demand from the Americas for slaves, the lucrative business continued, he added. There were dozens of known African slave traders who had sold thousands of people to European slave merchants. In West Africa, the traders were known as cabassiers, and they lived on the coast. They were usually appointed by the African rulers to deal directly with the European slave merchants. The website Port Cities Bristol, created to document the role of the English city of Bristol in the transatlantic slave trade reports. Many, such as the cabassier from the Fonte people, John Currentee, or the leader from the Efik people, Ephraim Robin John, known to the European traders as King George, were well known as canny and ruthless dealers. They were able to communicate in several European and African languages. The African slave traders were skilled in using to their advantage the rivalries between the French, the English, and the Dutch to get the best prices for their slaves. Often they demanded and received gifts or custom fees, known in some quarters as dashi, from the Europeans, it adds. African Woman says African nations owe African Americans reparations and are just as guilty and violent as were the white Europeans. She wants to know why only Europeans are shamed for the transatlantic slave trade and the brutality of slavery, but not the Africans. Umar Johnson and other African American Pan-Africanists have minimized Africa's brutal role in the slave trade, saying they did not know it would be as horrific as it was. They were fully aware and did not care. Umar Johnson is a fool and a clown. This is one reason why African Americans need our own homeland, neither in Africa nor the U.S., unless one or both give us land and we can have our own nation-state. Most of these traders continued selling slaves despite the ban, while others used the slaves to work on plantations in Africa. We highlight some of the notorious African slave traders who played active roles in the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade stands as a horrific monument to human cruelty and greed. For centuries, millions of Africans were ripped from their homes, brutalized, and subjected to unimaginable suffering. The issue of reparations for the transatlantic slave trade is a complex and contentious one, deeply rooted in centuries of history and injustice. While there is a growing global movement demanding reparations from European nations, the call for justice is not limited to one side of the Atlantic. The question of whether African nations should also pay reparations is a subject of heated debate, adding another layer to this multifaceted issue. Some argue that African nations, having benefited economically and politically from the slave trade, should not be exempt from this responsibility. They believe these nations bear a moral responsibility to contribute to reparations, acknowledging their role in this dark chapter of history. Others contend that holding African nations accountable ignores the power imbalances of the time, where European powers dominated and coerced. They argue that placing the burden of responsibility on the victims of colonial exploitation is unjust. This debate, often fraught with emotion and historical baggage, stirs deep feelings and differing perspectives. It highlights the deep and lasting impact of the slave trade on the African psyche, affecting generations. The need for open and honest dialogue about its legacy is crucial for healing and understanding. Only through such dialogue can we hope to address the injustices of the past and move towards a more equitable future. Human stories, lasting scars, the individual cost of a global tragedy. Beyond the statistics and historical analysis, it is essential to remember the individual human cost of the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were torn from their families, stripped of their dignity, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. Their stories, often passed down through generations, serve as a stark reminder of the brutality of the trade and its enduring impact. From the crowded holds of slave ships to the auction blocks of the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade left an indelible mark on the lives of millions, a wound that continues to resonate through generations. The Asante Empire, a case study in power, commerce, and captivity. The Asante Empire, located in present-day Ghana, stands as a significant example of African history. It provides a compelling case study of African involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, highlighting the complexities of power and commerce. The Asante rose to prominence in the 17th century, establishing themselves as a formidable force in West Africa. Their power was fueled by their strategic control over the trade routes that crisscrossed the region and their access to firearms, which they acquired through the exchange of enslaved Africans with European traders. The Asante Hine, the supreme ruler of the empire, commanded a vast and well-organized army and controlled a sophisticated trading network that funneled captives from the interior to the coast, where they were sold into slavery. The story of the Asante Empire is a complex one, filled with both triumphs and tragedies. It serves as a testament to the devastating impact of the slave trade on African societies, but also to the agency and influence of African rulers in shaping the course of history. The Asante were not merely victims, they were active participants in a global system of trade and power. Their legacy is a reminder of the complexities of history and the enduring impact of the choices made by those in power. Today, the artifacts and stories of the Asante continue to be studied and revered, offering valuable insights into a pivotal era in African history. Pan-Africanism at a crossroads. Pan-Africanism at a crossroads, reconciling with a complex past. The transatlantic slave trade presents a significant challenge to the ideals of Pan-Africanism, a movement that emphasizes the unity and solidarity of Africans worldwide. The historical reality of Africans enslaving other Africans forces a difficult conversation about responsibility, reconciliation, and the complexities of a shared past. Some Pan-Africanist thinkers have sought to downplay or deflect African involvement in the slave trade, arguing that it undermines the movement's message of unity and strength. Others argue that confronting this difficult history in all its complexity is essential for genuine reconciliation and healing. Notable voices, navigating the terrain of truth and reconciliation. The conversation surrounding Africa's role in the slave trade has been shaped by numerous scholars, activists, and public figures. This dialogue is crucial for understanding the multifaceted perspectives on a deeply complex and painful history. Webb Du Bois, a prominent African-American sociologist and Pan-Africanist, acknowledged the role of African chiefs in the slave trade, but argued that they were ultimately pawns in a larger European game. His work emphasized the broader context of European exploitation and manipulation, shedding light on the intricate dynamics of power and subjugation. Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, in his seminal work Things Fall Apart, explored the complexities of pre-colonial African societies and the impact of European arrival. Achebe's narrative delves into the cultural, social, and political structures that existed before colonization, offering a nuanced portrayal of African life and the disruptive forces of European imperialism. These voices, among many others, demonstrate the ongoing struggle to grapple with the legacy of the slave trade and its implications for understanding African history and identity. The discourse continues to evolve as contemporary scholars and activists build upon the foundations laid by their predecessors, striving to uncover truths and foster reconciliation in the face of historical injustices. A call to action, acknowledging the past to heal the future, confronting the uncomfortable truths of Africa's involvement in the slave trade. It is about acknowledging a shared history, understanding the complexities of the past, and using that knowledge to build a more just and equitable future. This requires open and honest dialogue, both within Africa and globally, about the lasting legacy of the slave trade and its impact on contemporary issues such as racism, inequality, and the ongoing struggle for social justice. moving forward towards a more nuanced understanding. The transatlantic slave trade is a stark reminder of the capacity for human cruelty and greed. Confronting Africa's role in this tragedy is not an attempt to diminish the suffering of those enslaved or to absolve European colonizers of their crimes. It is, however, essential for a more complete and nuanced understanding of history. Only by acknowledging the complexities of the past, including the agency of all those involved, can we hope to learn from it and work towards a future free from the shackles of exploitation and injustice. African Woman says African nations owe African Americans reparations and are just as guilty and violent as were the white Europeans. She wants to know why only Europeans are shamed for the transatlantic slave trade and the brutality of slavery, but not the Africans. Umar Johnson and other African American Pan-Africanists have minimized Africa's brutal role in the slave trade, saying they did not know it would be as horrific as it was. They were fully aware and did not care. Umar Johnson is a fool and a clown. This is one reason why African Americans need our own homeland neither in Africa nor the U.S. unless one or both give us land, and we can have our own nation-state. This has been The Awakening, Black Women United. I am your host, Sherry Danny. Subscribe, like, share, comment, and hit the notification bell so you know every time I upload a new video.